she's got to say. So I'll let everyone welcome to the stage John.
Great, thank you. Thanks. So yes, my name's Siân. I'm the Chief Security Advisor for Northern Europe in the Enterprise Cybersecurity Group at Microsoft. Yes, I do have an MBE for Services to Cybersecurity, so I've worked in cybersecurity for over 20 years, done a lot of stuff both in terms of working with customers about being secure, but also in terms of helping to ensure that we build the skills that we need for cybersecurity for the next generation sort of thing. So I'm sort of putting together a little bit of an overview of security from the Microsoft perspective, but also the importance of identity within security. So those people that work in security, quite often identities historically been treated as the poor man. Everyone knew they had to do it, but they didn't necessarily do it in the best way, and now it's becoming important. So effectively, it's talking about how we do security. I think I was sitting in on the keynotes this morning. We were talking about the sort of hybrid approach and the need to look at both cloud and on-premise. So really looking at how we can do security in that hybrid cloud era and really the importance of identity within that. So the first thing is obviously security now is more important than it's ever been. So businesses and users really do rely on trust for technology. All you have to do is look at some of the headlines over the last month or so. Even whether it's not security, it's approach, trust in an organization and sharing data with is absolutely essential. So how many people here are thinking of deleting their Facebook account? I'm not, by the way. I'm quite comfortable with keeping my Facebook account, but I also don't tell you my entire life story on it either. So it's about how you choose to use it. To be honest, if I didn't have Facebook, I'd never speak to my auntie. It's a good way to know what's going on with your family, but you don't necessarily want to tell them everything. But from the point of view of a cloud service, of a provision of something we're providing now, particularly for something like Microsoft, if people don't trust what we're doing, then essentially they're not going to adopt it. So security's in a way moved from where it was traditionally as the sort of business prevention department, the just say no department, the guys in the corner that talked about the risk to, actually, if you don't build security in, if you don't build trust in, then effectively you're going to affect the adoption and take-up of products and services and trust of the organisation. So it's absolutely essential. So obviously I have to put Satya Nadella saying that importantly, but this belief in this is why they created the group I work for, the Enterprise Cybersecurity Group, a group of industry experts brought in to work within Microsoft, both to help ourselves be more secure, but also to help work with customers to use Microsoft technology securely. So so if we actually, what I want to do is to talk about, if you look about some of the IT threats of Microsoft security. So quite often security people can get very much full of fear, uncertainty and doubt, or I think Microsoft's a bit further now. But actually, if you want to look at where all the threats and trends come from, the fact is that as we start to use technology in a new way, people work out how to exploit it, they work out how to use that for nefarious reasons. And that's not just a technology thing, that's anything we do. The minute people started to have cars, then people started to do, hijacking. It goes back to anything, there's a control. But if you look at technology, if you go back to the mainframe and PC era, the sort of the 80s and 90s, then effectively the main security trend was attacks by hobbyists and enthusiasts. So pretty much the major control then was things like antivirus, anti-malware, that sort of approach. Then you go into data centers and mobile devices, the sort of more ubiquitous use of technology. Then people can work out that there's a complete monetization of attacks. And the more we actually do things online, the more we rely on that, the more we do online banking, online shopping, then the more there is money to be made out of that. And then now as we go into cloud and the Internet of Things, effectively we're beginning to bake technology completely into our everyday life, into everything we do. There's almost nothing you could think of that doesn't involve technology. So obviously going back to Just Eat this morning, even getting a takeaway is technology. Anyone working in a hotel thing has technology. There's almost no way that you don't have some sort of technology, online involvement in what you do. And things like the cloud and Internet of Things. So from the attacker point of view, you can really industrialize attacks. You can start to build that into warfare. And we started to see that in a way, the NotPetya attack, which happened last year. So everyone remember the WannaCry and NotPetya? NotPetya was an example of industrialized warfare. It was an attack on the Ukraine. There was just a slide effect that it went after the the Medox tax server in Ukraine, but every company that worked in the Ukraine had to run that bit of software, which means that those companies that ran that software in global got infected beyond the target, but the target was almost definitely the Ukraine. So in terms of the fact that it was integrated into warfare, it's now seen as the sort of fifth pillar of warfare. So if you think about the security controls, you have to see, going back to, I was talking about the fact that when it was attacked by hobbyists and enthusiasts, that when you had the virus and worm epidemics, it's not a coincidence that most of the major endpoint security vendors out there, the anti-malware vendors were actually founded in the 80s, because that's when they found. So you look at McAfee, Symantec, Trend, they were mostly all founded in the 80s and early 90s, and that's because that's when viruses and worms were the biggest issue you have. We do put the Trustworthy Computing Initiative there in 2002 because Microsoft was known for having challenges. Well, everyone was with bugs, and obviously the issue of software. That's when we actually brought in the concept of the secure development lifecycle, actually making sure that we're training developers to produce secure code. Doesn't mean you get it perfect, but it means you're actually trying your best to make it more secure, to make it harder to attack. But then as people start to monetize attacks across data centers and mobile devices, you have to go beyond point software into more of a platform security approach, and then looking at how you can deal with some of these waves of target attacks. What we've had up until recently is a hesitation by security departments on the cloud. So even though the business might want to adopt cloud, there's a sort of concern about what you're going to do with particularly sensitive data and approaches in terms of adoption of cloud. We're beginning now, and I've definitely seen it since joining Microsoft, but I saw it before I joined as well, of people beginning to look at cloud services, so things like Workday, Office 365, Salesforce becoming standard, which means that you then need to think about how we're going to deal with that. And it is about, if technology is baked into our everyday lives, I think going back to what Brandon was saying this morning, too often we make security an unpleasant experience. So what we need to do is look at how we could create an integrated security experience. So going back to that secure and productive approach to working. So really that whole idea of how we can actually make security part of what you're doing, not a separate thing you have to opt into. So the way I often talk about is users are like rivers. They try and find the easiest way down the hill. If you make the security really hard, they're just going to go around it. So effectively make security something that's easy to use, easy to engage with. People want to be secure, so therefore they will choose that approach. So that's really the core of where we are at the moment, and that's the core to Microsoft's security strategy. Information security on a wider level is also in transformation. So enterprise IT is no longer the fortress model of the enclosed environment. You've got this hybrid cloud. Your cloud adoption is happening, as I was saying. There is the digital transformation. There is the whole industry momentum towards moving it. The thing is, though, you're not turning off the things that are on-premise. There's lots of legacy systems available. Particularly if you look at things like the financial sector, you've got a lot of legacy banking systems, big mainframe systems you're not going to turn off. And then you've got your cool cloud stuff that you're trying to do, the modern digital workplace, and then the concern is you've got to work out how you can put a control in across both of those. Technology, mobility and volume is exploding. Effectively, people do want a first-class mobile experience. So a few years ago, the sort of standard for mobile access was sort of the over-the-top, hardened, secured access to devices, things that were focused on security rather than necessarily usability. So the sort of BlackBerry world, the good technology type world where people had that lockdown control and you had access, but you didn't necessarily have a full productive experience on your mobile device, and people are now looking for that. The challenge is, of course, as you start to enable it, is that not all mobile devices are equal. Not everyone's got good hygiene on their mobile device. So it's how do you actually apply and control that variance in trustworthiness of those devices. The fact that we have now got digital transformation, and if mobile devices work hard enough, we're now putting in IoT, connecting everything to the internet, whether we need to or not. I still will never understand why you have an internet-connected toaster, because you've got to walk up to the toaster to put the bread in, you've got to walk up to it to get the toast out. What is the benefit of it being connected? But hey, everyone wants to connect everything, and the challenge is that brings security, app development, cloud usage. If you look at most of the IoT devices that are out there at the moment, particularly consumer devices, with it comes an abundance of apps, an abundance of identities, an abundance of things you've got to log on to. Not all of them have equal security. There's a whole challenge that comes with that. And then from the IoT device point of view in the enterprise, things that work really well for IT don't work really well for IoT devices and operational technology. So in operational technology in a factory, availability is the most important thing. Mostly in enterprise IT, it's about confidentiality and integrity, with availability being maybe the third in the strand. So we have to actually adapt what we do for that. And the fact is that there is an increasing attack surface. As we do more technology, we create more of an attack surface, people work out how to attack it. So there is an increasingly hostile environment. Nothing to get too negative about. That is just a side effect of the fact that we rely on technology now, so people try to exploit it. If we turned all the technology off, they'd just go back to a different way of doing it. So the upside of there being more financial fraud and banking Trojans is there's probably less armed robberies than there used to be. So arguably it's a safer world to be. So just talking a little bit more about that transformation of the modern enterprise. So this is the sort of traditional enterprise where you had your fortress of your on-premise network, you have all your controls, your mobile devices had to connect into the on-premise network to get what they want. It's effectively that whole on-premise security, lots of boundaries, lots of controls. This is where a lot of security departments still sit now in terms of how do I bring it all into my perimeter and control it that way. The challenge is then that in terms of all the things people are trying to do with digital transformation and the adoption of SaaS services from Office 365 to Salesforce to Workday to Box to ServiceNow, etc., that means that a lot of the corporate data, a lot of the things that people are accessing and working are actually outside of that premise. And then when people want a first-class mobile experience, having to run an enforced, virtual private network back into the corporate network, having to use tools that aren't necessarily designed from the mobile device, that just creates an unpleasant experience that users don't want to use. And once they've got SaaS adoption, they will try and work out how they can get into that without coming back on premise. Then the Internet of Things is quite often outside the corporate network. And then when people start to adopt things like infrastructure services or platform as a service, suddenly all of this is your network, not just the stuff that's on premise. And so effectively the modern enterprise perimeter is across that. And what's the one common perimeter you've got? It's actually identity. So as we talked this morning, there's multiple different identities you can have, but you pretty much usually have one work identity. And so that identity and access perimeter is the way to differentiate between work access and personal access. So even things like Office 365, you have your corporate access, and you might even have personal Office 365, but you can differentiate between them around the identity. So identity is really much more important in the hybrid cloud world than it was on premise. So things that it was always important, but you could get away with not necessarily having things under control. Now it's absolutely essential to really have a good control of identity. Going back to what I said this morning, identity being that control plane. So the challenges you've got in terms of looking across this hybrid world and moving from an on-premise to a cloud-based from a security point of view is keeping visibility and control over blind spots. Now, quite often that's making sure that people wanting to send everything back on premise, but that effectively, if every cloud service sends things back on premise to review, we're going to drown most security operations teams out there. So it's really looking at how you can use things like the identity perimeter to get visibility and control over blind spots that might not be corporately controlled infrastructure. Looking at how you can do automated policy monitoring, automated enforcement across the estate. So very much like Just Eat was saying this morning, it's that ability to be able to put that control in place. And then actually looking at threat protection. So a lot of traditional threat protection is very much focused on the endpoint, which is still very important because everyone tends to have a device. But then it's also traditionally focused on the network security boundary. And it's not the case that you don't still need that, but the fact is you need extra agile approaches as well to deal with access that may not actually come through the corporate environment. How do you detect things that may not actually be coming through your corporate network boundary? And then obviously intellectual property is control. So data protection, data governance is something that's been around and talked about for 25 to 30 years. People haven't necessarily done it well. It's been one of those things we've got away without actually doing properly. And arguably, going back to the four-letter word, things like the GDPR are just bringing that to the highlight now, the fact that you need to do it. So I wasn't able to be in the GDPR workshop, but it's effectively highlighting the fact that it really is just asking for good risk management and good data governance. And if you already had that, it wouldn't be a problem. But the fact is that we've sort of, for 30 years, grown our amount of data we store, but not necessarily put control over that as we've done it. And so effectively, we're cleaning up 30 years of digital growth at the moment. And it's obviously personal data is one reason to do it for the GDPR, but there are plenty of other reasons. Intellectual property data, mergers and acquisitions data, all this stuff may actually go into the cloud, off your premise. And actually, so then you need to have some understanding. And one of the challenges, people quite often just take the big mess they've got on premise and upload it as a whole to the cloud, and you still haven't got that control and policy around it. And that becomes even more important as you're going into a more hybrid world. So I won't dwell on this because I think we talked about this a bit this morning, but effectively, historically, we talked about that balance between security or productivity. You can choose which you want or pick where you are on the scale. And at one end, you've got the locking it in concrete, sticking it 6 feet under, no one can access it without asking a 50-page questionnaire, really hard to use. At the other end, you've got completely open and access, usually what the chief executive asked for, no security, get to everything I want. And it was always chosen as an either or. And in reality, what we need to do is make it both. So you don't have to choose, you get security and productivity. And the things that help make that happen is biometric authentication, it is single sign-on approaches, it is like conditional access that we were talking about this morning, it is things like mobile application management, things that you could see as either security or productivity applications, but effectively it's not a security or, it's a both, doing the two together. So if we look at some of the other challenges we see around identities, attackers have been using identity to bypass network controls for a while, and it's becoming more so. So if I've got a valid identity, a network control will mostly let you in. So if you don't have protection around identity, then effectively things like firewalls and proxies and all those sort of great on-premise network security tools become effectively useless. So phishing is one of the major ways that all breaches happen now. I think something like 85% of breaches into corporate networks start with a phishing email. Credential theft, it really allows them to expand access by impersonating identities. So we're talking about, have you been pwned this morning? If someone's been pwned, quite often they use the same password across everything. That whole using their corporate email address to create an account on another service that's got nothing to do with the company, but guess what? They probably use the same password that they use on their corporate email as well. So somebody's got that, they can then use that to try and get into the environment. Passwords don't really work. Singular factor, you can really break them very quickly. Even if they haven't actually used the same password across everything and haven't got it from a pwned, 90% of people use their dog's name, their family members' names, dates of birth that are important, their kids' names. There's sort of like 5 questions you can ask and you can guess most people's passwords as long as you put 1, 2, 3 or exclamation mark on the end of it. So effectively it's not that strong, particularly in the social media world where you could find all those things out without even talking to them. And then actually credential attacks will circumvent things like software assurances. When you've got lockdown and control, if I've got a valid credential, that will quite often ruin all of that. And then obviously, as I was just saying, identities are used outside the network. So people actually going beyond enterprise controls, then effectively identity and access controls, it can be inconsistent across different services. So it's all about bringing that together. I think going back to what we were saying this morning about identity being a new control plane. And so obviously then looking at security productivity from a value creation point of view, effectively looking at how you can use security and mobility with the full functionality. So not only to protect those credentials, lock them down and control them, but also to give some productivity back to the users. So things like biometrics and single sign-on are possibly the most popular security technology I've ever seen rolled out because at the same time as improving someone's protection, they also don't have to type an 8 or 10 character password in on their mobile device. They can use things like Touch ID or Face ID or whatever they use on their mobile device to enable it. They can actually not have to worry about what their password is to a lot of credentials because that's all taken care of by the single sign-on solution. So it can be a very, very popular as well as secure approach. And I'm going to skip through this because I say, well, this is sort of like going back to as we move across some of the evolution of the identity threats that we've seen. So alongside this move around security, things like back in the mainframe and PC world, it was all about local identities, everyone having the same widespread password. password weakness and reuse of that password. Having said that, though, password is still the #1 password in the world, so it's not changed really. Then enterprise single sign-on, two-factor authentication, forcing people to actually get around the fact that they use password or Rover as their main password. And then actually now that hybrid and federated cloud identity that we've been talking about today, that's the sort of next move in terms of that. And this is all about, not just about how we can put identity as a control plane, but how we can counter the way that attackers are working. So the fact that they're getting passwords, the fact they're doing phishing attacks, this sort of approach allows us to get some more control, to prevent it if possible, but if not, to at least become aware, to detect and respond to it and be able to lock down as quickly as possible. And to just reiterate that, if you think about the security perimeters, historically we had the nice castle, then we got the network control effectively, and we are now looking at identity as that perimeter. So if you look at the way most network security worked, though, it pretty much was running the mindset of it still being a castle, of everything being secure walls and no access. And with identity, you need to have a slightly different, more nuanced approach to that. So that approach being looking at a few things, so looking at visibility and control across the estate, looking at where sensitive data is being used, linking that to who accessed it, so you know whether the right people are accessing it, being able to look at both the corporate and the software as a service applications that are being used, looking at managed devices, but also mobile devices that are maybe less controlled, how you can actually put some control in across those. And then obviously some specific areas around, around that. So I always get annoyed by this build, sorry, it always puts me off. So some particular issues around things like looking at how you can deal with things like phishing attacks, credential theft, looking at how you control the data moving out the network. You have to put identity into the middle of that. So that is things like strong authentication, monitoring and enforcing access policies linked to that identity, but then also threat intelligence. So as we're talking about this morning, knowing when a credential's being compromised, knowing when it's being pwned and stopping that being used to access sensitive data. Because the moment it's being owned, even if it looks valid, it doesn't matter because it may not actually be the valid person using it, it may be the attacker. And then from the point of view, going beyond that into identity and access management, really looking at how quickly the identity system is an absolute critical dependency for most or all security assurances. If you don't have good reliance on your identity system, then everything else you do is going to fall apart. So that's why when you speak to Microsoft, we'll quite often talk about hardening the identity system to the highest point that you can. So obviously, if you're using Azure Active Directory, that's done in the way it's been built. But actually, in terms of on-premise AD, that's an important thing. Hardening that, making sure that it's got the right controls. That is possibly the most critical system after your production systems you've got in the world. And even then, quite often you only get to your production systems through AD. So if you don't have that hardened, that can be a point of compromise. If you look at the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks from last year, those that got really, really attacked were the ones that tend to have less hardened or issues in their Active Directory systems. It's absolutely key. And it's as part of that, it's absolutely key to make sure that privileged administrators are locked down. Going into the intelligence we were talking about this morning about how many privileged admins were actually compromised, that's quite often caused by people using the same account for browsing the internet, for doing email, for doing the general day-to-day as they do for administering the identity system, and you really shouldn't do that. It should be two separate accounts. So although we talk about making it security and productive and easy to use, make it slightly harder for administrators to work to protect it so you can allow everyone else to have an easier time of it, really. Making sure that you've got some strong assurance of that identity is absolutely essential. If you don't have a strong assurance of identity, then effectively, it doesn't matter how good the device is, how good every other control you've got, it will fall apart. And then looking at where the sensitive data is going, being able to in order to be able to know that you've got control over sensitive data, you've got the right people accessing it, you have to have some reassurance around the identities that are actually looking at that data. So just to continue on with this drive, if you look, this is the sort of traditional way of doing visibility and control at the perimeter. So you have the firewall, and it's all about, are you the right source or destination? You then have intrusive detection and prevention, looking at signatures over the top of that, and then maybe a forward or reverse proxy controlling what you can and can't get to. That's where a lot of people think, and it's either allow or block or let it go. If we actually move that to the identity approach, then it's a slightly different thing. So it's like the user, do they have rights? What's their role? What's their group? What's their device? Where's their location? What's their last sign in that? Are they all good, risky thing, in a good state to allow us to allow access? But then the device, is the device okay, or is the device jailbroken or full of malware or in a bad approach or completely open, a bad config? That then goes into, that's why conditional access is so important in this new perimeter, because it's actually looking at the user and the device. Those two things together have to be in a good state before you allow access to sensitive data. But then it doesn't have to just be allow or block. It can be allow, it can be ask for multi-factor authentication in case of identity to prove it is the real person. It can be force remediation, make someone patch or clean themselves up or get rid of the malware. Or it could even be allow restricted. I'm going to allow you to have access, but I'm not going to allow you to get to our most sensitive data. Yeah, and going back to the identity system and the critical security events, as I said, everything depends on the integrity of your identity. If you don't have that good integrity, you're in a bad state. So when you get the slides through, there's a couple of links to a couple of automated attacks with some illustrations of how they work. So we do then give some advice about how to harden the identity system to the control. This is something we do recommend everyone does. So there's the securing privileged access roadmap. There's looking at things like security standards for the identity system. And then actually, we do have services to help with the sort of tiering model for Active Directory. Obviously, in Azure AD, we provide a lot of that control ourselves, but that will link to your on-premise Active Directory, which is important to get into a good state. And this is really essential. So there's lots of things we could talk about in terms of the security capability we're building into Office 365, which I think we've covered today, things like identity and information protection, threat protection that we've got in that control, but actually configuring your own identity system is essential to that. And so I didn't really want to drill down too much into the specifics around the other things we do, given that this is the identity forum today, but really from the point of view of Microsoft's strategy, we're focusing on 4 pillars. So one is security management, so gaining end-to-end visibility into your organization's security, being able to manage the security policy internally, be able to see what happens across Office 365, across Windows 10, across Azure, be able to get some visibility across that and be able to put policies in place and be assured that they are being enforced. So in Office 365, there's plenty of security controls that are available that people can use. Many people don't enable them, even if they're entitled and licensed to them. So this will actually help you to get visibility of what's there to use. And then in things like Azure, as people start to do infrastructure as a service, the real danger of the sort of DevOps world and the people being able to build their own devices is that they just spin up a virtual machine without any security or any configuration on it, put a service on it, and before you know it, you're exposed. There's quite a few of the major breaches that have been highlighted in the last couple of years that have basically been misconfiguration of cloud infrastructure as a service. So effectively being able to get some visibility and management of that is important. Identity and access management, which is what I've mostly been talking about, is effectively is a core part of this. It is ensuring only the right people have access to the organizational systems, whether they're on-premise or in the cloud. Information protection, which there was a workshop about this afternoon. Making sure that those documents and emails are only viewed by the intended recipients, making sure that the right people get access to the right data. And then the threat protection, looking at how you can actually stop hackers. And that's both stopping malicious software, but it's also detecting and blocking phishing attacks, finding malicious links, cleaning up Office documents. It's not just about email, it's about across the entire Office 365 infrastructure, across Windows, about how we can lock down and control that, and then about the Azure world as well. So it's effectively how you can actually bake security into the entire operating system, into the platform, to make sure that there's no way that it can be bypassed. So that was really it. I just want to, I did give you a sort of whistle-stop tour, but effectively the core thing from the Microsoft security approach point of view is really ensuring security is there to enable the digital transformation, looking at the comprehensive platform. One thing we are doing is building a lot of intelligence into that to make sure that we detect things like compromised credentials, threats, phishing attacks, block them, stop them happening, and then obviously having broad partnerships across the industry and with with partners such as identity experts to make sure that people are getting the right things that they need to do to be secure. So that was it really, thank you. Thanks.
Wonderful.